everyone who is coming in and has joined. This is being recorded, as Zoom will, of course, tell you. And so this will be distributed for those who registered and are not watching this live. Thank you for catching this later. We appreciate your attendance. For those of you who are coming into the room right now, we thank you for taking the time to spend some time here this morning, sharing stories, listening to stories, learning and growing together. We're grateful for these opportunities to have our community conversations. Of course, this is hosted by United Way of Lancaster County. And before I begin talking about our specific thing, I want to just let you all know of something that we're doing at United Way right now, a fundraising effort that we're really excited about. It's called Level Up and Launch. We've identified 9 different organizations who have found various issues in the community that could be, the innovation can meet them for scalability and proper outcomes in a community advancing way. And so we're really excited. The way that we're doing this is we've put out $250,000 in money to these 9 organizations. And over the next couple of months through the end of October, the monies that they raise towards these projects, we will match dollar for dollar up to their original grant amount. So we're hoping to be able to use our resources to encourage philanthropy amongst the community. I'm going to take a real quick moment and just show you our quick little hype video. And then we'll get started. So as people come in, we'll do that. And make sure to share sound. I'm doing some video clip. So if you're interested in that and supporting those initiatives, there's a lot of cool projects we won't get into today, obviously, but head over to United Way's website, uwlanc.org, and /level up and launch, or go to the main site and you can navigate there. So really excited about those projects. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on there. So thank you all for your financial support of United Way, which allows us to help other organizations with their capacity through financial resources and other support, as well as hosting conversations like this. So we've got a good number of people here joining us today, and I know not all of you were in right when we started. So again, I am Kevin Ressler, President, CEO of United Way of Lancaster County. Deeply grateful for your time, deeply grateful for each of these panelists, which I will now invite to introduce themselves. Joe, you're right there on my left. I'll go ahead with you. Joe Landis.
All right. Hi all, and good morning. Glad that I can be here for this panel. I am a lifelong resident of Lancaster County, except for 7 years away, which, as I share my story later on, you'll see was very formative for being able to come back to the area and be more open in being a gay man. I come from a conservative evangelical background. I also come from a family with lots of diverse interests and global interests. So ended up learning Arabic and living abroad in Jordan, and getting involved in refugee services issues. And now I work for our local refugee resettlement agency, Church World Service, as their housing specialist. So I'm also trained as an urban planner. So it's a nice way that those interests and passions come together. So excited to be here, and go ahead and pass it to the next person, Kevin.
Thank you, Joe. And we'll go over here. Brian, you're on my other side.
Hi, happy Pride Month, friends, and happy Tuesday. My name is Brian Wynn. My pronouns are he, they. I am the communications manager for the Community Action Partnership of Lancaster County, as well as the Lancaster LGBTQ Coalition here in Lancaster. I'm a first-generation Vietnamese American. I identify as gay, and I'm happy to be here. So thanks, Kevin. Thanks, United Way.
Absolutely. Mickey.
Hi, my name is Mickey Dawson. I use he, him pronouns. I am the secretary for Lancaster Pride, and I work for the Harrisburg Midtown Arts Center as their assistant production manager. I'm an out and visible trans man, and I focus on kind of bringing people together, and that's why I'm part of Pride and live events.
Thank you. My dear lifelong friend, since she was this big, Liz Fulmer.
Yeah, you have too many stories, Kevin. My name is Liz Fulmer. I use she, her pronouns. I grew up in Lancaster as well and moved away for just long enough to realize that Lancaster has some gems that I didn't realize in my growing up days. I am gay. I am married to a beautiful, wonderful woman, and we are parents to a 4.5-year-old monster who we also love very much. I'm associate pastor at Grandview Church, and Grandview has been in the news because we had been part of the United Methodist Church and then disaffiliated over the church's discriminatory policies toward gay and lesbian and trans individuals. So the church is taking a stand against that. And in that process, I was ordained just recently by the church and in collaboration with other inclusive Methodists. So very excited to be here embodying things that seem to contradict each other, being queer and being Christian. So I'm happy to bring that into the space.
Thank you, Liz. And you can catch Liz preaching Grandview frequently, but you can rarely catch me preaching at Grandview except on July 24th. I will be preaching at Grandview Church, and I'm really excited about that. Haven't done that in a couple of years. It's a wonderful community. So if you want to hear me rant and rave for 20 minutes, Sunday the 24th of July, I'll be preaching at Grandview. Thank you for that invitation to share your holy space, Liz. And lastly, but not least, I'm going to invite Mark. Mark's going to go into a presentation for us. So Mark's done. If you want to introduce yourself, the rest of us will drop off, mute ourselves, and drop off of our screens. We'll come back afterwards. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for giving Mark your attention.
Hi, I'm Mark Stoner. I'm a Lancaster County native, lived here pretty much all my life except for college and a couple years after. I've been involved in the gay community here for a long, long time. I identify as gay and use the pronouns he, him. I am presently working for hospice as a graphic designer. And one of the things in developing what I did today, I'll point out some hospice there that came through. Now I have to figure out to share my screen. And I'm hoping we're getting one big slide there.
Nope, got the wrong one.
I have the wrong one.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. I don't know why it always does that. So you're seeing one slide now, correct?
Nope, I'm still seeing them.
Still the wrong one.
It is now swapping between that and itself.
Let me stop the share and start again.
I swear, everyone, we practiced this and he nailed it earlier.
Yeah, we did practice this. Let's try. What's that?
Nope, same. There you go. Now you're good.
Okay. I don't know how I even did any of that, but anyway, I just wanted to thank some people. A lot of these slides were prepared originally by Eric Kearsley. He's a gay man who actually retired to a community in Lancaster. When COVID hit, he started to reach out to a lot of people about local gay history, and he did several presentations, and last year during Pride and the year before did displays at his community. and he felt very unwelcome there. And so it's kind of a loss, but he's no longer in Lancaster County. But the work he did was great. Most of this content is either things I've gathered, or the LGBT Center of Central PA has a history project that they started several years ago that I was involved with. From that came a book called Out in Central Pennsylvania. That was written by William Burton and Barry Loveland, and was based on the research that they started with the history project. They've also had some traveling exhibits. Some have been here in Lancaster, called The Long Road. And they also had one on gay Cubans that came to and were housed at Fort Indiantown Gap in the 1970s. And then the materials that they gather are housed at Dickinson College Archives and Special Collections. So there's a whole LGBT history collection there. And then some of this stuff I've shared on an Instagram called Lancaster LGBTQ History, if you ever want to get some of the images. We're in Pride Month, and basically, just to update everyone, Pride is kind of a commemoration of the Stonewall Uprising, which happened early in the morning of June 28th, 1969. At that time, there weren't many bars or meeting places for gays and lesbians, and in big cities like New York, most of those bars were mafia run. There were all kinds of laws at that time, like you could be, and laws that were only enforced really against LGBTQ people. One was like you could be arrested if you had more than 2 items of opposite sex clothing. So if you were a woman and wearing a man's shirt and pants, you could be taken in. You couldn't buy drinks for another guy who was gay. Bars could actually be closed for allowing gay clientele. And basically, this bar, the Stonewall Inn, was raided early in the morning of June 28th, and there was pushback and a riot happened. And then there was a series of riots and demonstrations in the next several days. And that basically led to a year later, on June 28th, 1970, there were gay pride marches held in several different cities, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and that gradually spread. So Philadelphia had its first Gay Pride Day in 1972, but that wasn't really the start of the gay liberation movement. It really is an important point in history, but there had been events before. In fact, Philadelphia, there had been many gay organizations before this. I won't go into all of them, but in Philly, they started a July 4th march as early as 1965 and did that annually. Their approach was kind of different. It was, most of those activists were trying to fit in. And so they, women were asked to wear dresses and men were asked to wear ties and look very acceptable. And things like that would be covered locally. So here's coverage in the new era of the one demonstration one year, but just marginally. But in Lancaster, the earliest report I could find of gays and lesbians actually being named somewhere is there was a Vice report done in 1913 by a group of people and then distributed. It was printed as a little book and distributed. So if you see here, there's considerable evidence impossible to print of the practice of perversion in Lancaster by inmates of houses, by streetwalkers, charity girls, and by men perverts or fairies and degenerates. What's interesting about this, that Vice report was something that was done in many cities around the US. It was kind of a movement back then. And Charles DeMuth, the painter, actually is quoted as someone meeting him on the train back to Lancaster and talking to him, and he said he was returning to Lancaster to speak for Vice. then in the 20s, I found a report of a man who was arrested, and the police were nice enough to have him pose for the newspaper. So this was a front page paper article that just chastises him throughout with lots of puns and, and I just cannot imagine what he went through. I also found out I go to First United Methodist Church. He was a member of my church. To see how things this is something I found from 1934. A free lecture on homosexuals and freaks will be given in the home of the veterans of foreign wars on Prince Street. So that was kind of the way, what I'm getting ahead of myself here. In the 1940s, World War II happened, and that had a lot of people move. Men went into the service, people went to bigger cities, and for gay and lesbian people, that was an opportunity sometimes to meet others for the first time. And then actually, I had met a guy one time who was a veteran who just spoke about like coming back to Lancaster and feeling he had fought for freedom and everything, and then come back and feel totally isolated. Then in the 1950s, there was a real effort to, have women stop working and go back and be homemakers. And you probably have heard of the Joseph McCarthy hearings. They were very anti-communist, but there was also part of that was the lavender scare, where if you were working for the federal government, you could be fired because you were a security risk. And that was pretty much the tenor in the 1950s, as after the war, they were trying to push people back into traditional roles. But Pennsylvania actually was pretty, well, like we mentioned a little bit before Pride. So in the 60s, you have the civil rights efforts and protests. And out of that, there were many gay and lesbian actors in those movements. And that led to things like Stonewall. So that by the 70s, there are started to have some organized gay groups. And in 75, the governor of Pennsylvania, Milton Schaap, actually was the first, here, I'm trying to minimize something so I can read, signed an executive order that banned discrimination in state government. And then in 76, he formed a Pennsylvania Council for Sexual Minorities. And that group was active for about 10 years, but both of those efforts were kind of the first of their kind in the nation. But that also led to kind of a backlash. The situation then was very similar to now, that we had a Democratic governor and a legislature that was more conservative. So there were a number of anti-gay bills introduced, and that led to a lot of more local protests. This is a demonstration in Harrisburg in 1977. And locally, there was a group called the Gays United, and they did a number of things. Here, I'm sorry. They did a number of things. They had dances, they had spaghetti dinners, they'd have speakers come in, so regular ads in the paper. They got some coverage in the local paper. And kind of what that led to, though, was backlash here. There was a lot of vandalism. There were gay pride signs torn down. That sounds familiar still. They turned over the one guy's car. The state police reported only minimal damage was caused by the vandals. Also in 1966, the Tally Ho Tavern opened. Tally Ho Tavern and the Loft restaurant above it was owned by a gay couple, George and Gary. That has been around from 1966 when they opened, and it was not necessarily a gay bar, but when they had there used to be a gay meeting floor of the village, but the village was not where the present bar is. It was on Chestnut Street in an older building, and that building was torn down for the redevelopment they did in that area. And so when that closed, they made the Tally Ho more gay welcoming. And over time, it got known as a gay bar. There were other gay bars in the area, but then you ended up with things like front page articles saying that the area around the Tally Ho was a playground for gays. You know, like any bar, there were some bar issues and people leaving like late at night and things like that. So that area got known as kind of a gay area. Then we start getting into the 90s, but before I get into that, the big thing in the 1980s was that a new cancer was found, which later became known as AIDS. That really, first of all, was another thing that lesbian gay people fought to improve conditions, and they did that locally too. There was a group called the Lancaster AIDS Project. They would do things like every year give the county commissioners a bouquet of roses, indicating how many people lived in Lancaster with HIV. And this is the one place when I was looking at the caption, Janet Carroll, who was one of the important people to form hospice here, is almost seen in that picture. She's kind of standing behind, but she's listed in the caption. And so that was a dark time. And I would say most of the press you heard then either covered gays as victims or was very discriminatory. Then we get to 1991, which was a really tough year. As I said, around the Tally Ho, it was known kind of as a gay area. There actually was what was called a wolf pack bashing, where there was a man walking home at night who actually wasn't gay, but this group of youths assumed he was and beat him. That was in the newspapers a lot. And then the Lancaster City Council, as part of the Lancaster City County Human Relations Commission, passed an ordinance that covered sexual orientation as a protected class. And that just led to a debate that happened all summer. So it started in May, then the county said that the city had to rescind that or they would split the commission. I thought this was interesting. The New Era polled people, and when they got a number of 68% of the city residents were in support, they decided they had to break it out because some of those ballots were distributed by gay people, or gay people encouraging their friends and neighbors to speak out for them. So they kind of took out that any result from the drive and had listed it separately. I think mostly so the numbers wouldn't look so high. Then the city said, no, we won't change it. And then there were newspaper articles like almost every other day, it seemed, in the paper about many things. So there were things on hate crime statistics. And then one person that was instrumental, and this is Nancy Helm, she opened a small bookstore on Prince Street, kind of where Carmen and David's used to be, but just a tiny part of that space. It was called The Closet. It was a teeny tiny lesbian gay bookstore. On June 24th, kind of in the midst of all these newspaper articles and everything, the front windows of her establishment were blown out. So then it was a whole back and forth if it really was a gay, anti-gay thing. It's really the only place that was bombed around that time. A couple of years later, they bombed Planned Parenthood. On August 14th, the county commissioners voted to form their own Human Relations Commission, independent of the city. And at 2:30 a.m. the next day, there was a full stick of dynamite that exploded at the closet. So that was twice in a couple months. And that led to the following year, she actually ended up closing the bookstore. But from it also came the KKK March. They marched in August of that year. The leader was a local person named Charles Juba, and he pointed to the recent controversy over gay rights as the key reason for the march. He said the Klan objects to the opening of the Closet, a bookstore that sells predominantly gay and lesbian publications, and to downtown bars that cater to homosexuals. Would you want to have the Closet across from the Fulton Opera House? So there was a peaceful march. There was also a counter demonstration in Lancaster County Park, but it was something to see the Klan march right down through Lancaster. Nancy then was one of the people to form a group called the Pink Triangle Coalition. And that was a local group that from about 1991 to 2001 did a number of things. We had a bus trip down to the 1993 March on Washington for lesbian, gay, and bi equal rights. And as you go, you can see in the early years, everyone was referred to by as gay. Then it was kind of lesbian gay. By 1993, it was lesbian, gay, and bi. Still no mention of trans people at that time. Another thing, we had stars left over from a prom we did, and we decided to do, the library used to have a window that any group could put a display in. We had done it once before, but when we put one up saying celebrating lesbian, gay, and bisexual stars, the county actually threatened funding for the library. So that was front page news again. There was also the For Better or For Worse strip had a one that dealt with a teenager being gay, and they ended up stopping the strip at the time. So we had a protest against that. Other things we did were we had a newsletter, we would have events, roller skating, things. We adopted a highway just so we could get the words gay and lesbians of Lancaster somewhere, because that was nowhere. That was regularly vandalized, and we'd clean it or get it replaced. One of the other founders was Mary Merriman. She was a pastor at the Vision of Hope Metropolitan Community Church. They had originally worshiped at some other churches in town. When things kind of blew up around the gay issues, the church they met at would not let them meet there anymore. So she ended up starting the Vision of Hope community church that's in Mountville now. When that originally opened, it again was front page controversy. Since they opened, it's been very peaceful, but at the beginning they actually had, protection from bomb threats and things like that. And in 2001, we had constantly tried to, the city had this ordinance that said it protected lesbian, gay people, but there was no Human Relations Commission to enforce it. So finally, there was a City Human Relations Commission formed in 2001. And when that happened, that's also when we got gender identity covered, because by then LGBT was an important, trans people were seen as a part of the community. And then in 2008, we had our first Pride Fest in Lancaster at the Buchanan Park. It's very successful, and that goes on today, grows every year. Lancaster Pride just happened, and there were a couple other prides in the area. If you didn't see one in Lidditz, there's some events in Columbia. So it's great to see those efforts growing over time. It's also commemorated every year. There's always a pride flag hung in Lancaster now. There are other events. This is the Trans Day of Remembrance in 2019. But you got to remember that Pennsylvania has a ton of hate groups. Some of them listed here. And I just want to point back to, things that are happening then now resonate to me with things that happened back then. The Lidditz Pride had protesters that had white nationalist roots. They still use those same kind of excuses that they're upholding Christian values and things like that to get their racism and anti-gay beliefs into the mainstream. And that's the end of my presentation. I hope you found it informative, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Mark. Some heavy stuff. I'll welcome the panelists back up here. There's definitely some heavy stuff. And so before we get going, I'm gonna put up a quick little image I have here. Or maybe I won't. Give me 1 second. Why do you not want to work? Sometimes Zoom just makes me mad.
Well, can I ask a question? Are what I just covered, most people, are they familiar with those issues or facts, or?
Yeah, I'd be interested in panelists. I know I am, but sort of LGBT issues have been of chief interest of mine. Actually, Liz's older brother was one of my best friends in high school, and he was probably the first or one of the first to come out while still in high school. And he and I had a lot of conversations, and we sort of supported him in that. So that was, for me, 2002, 2003. And so some of your history was going on around that time. And so as I started paying attention to those issues, it was still there. And then having done community work, things with the Human Relations Commission, the KKK, so those of us who've done Black Lives Matter and start to look into the history, you start to see these oppressions often have intersections. And what is unfortunate, and I will say this is, there are at least 2 Christian pastors on this call, Liz and myself, is that oftentimes Christianity is blamed in a way that is not inherently commensurate with Christianity, because people use whatever they need to as scapegoats for their hate. And it is a convenient ploy to use, and the same could be talked about with the Supreme Court case this past Friday, a lot of times sort of groups that are associated with. And so for me, Mark, a lot of this has been, as you look into various oppressions locally, regardless of which way you come in, whether it's, LGBT issues, whether it's racism, whether it's Asian hate, whatever those various vectors are, you start to see this history of hatred in Lancaster is unfortunately far too prevalent, and the same suspects, the usual suspects, keep cropping up. But I know that I'm a little older than many of the panelists, so I would be very curious to that question to the rest of you all. Is this stuff that you're aware of?
As a transplant, I can definitely appreciate it, because I've heard stories of like the Tally Ho and like things like that, where I just missed it. And so as someone who's a younger generation, it's nice to sing praise and just remember those who laid the foundation for all of us. So thank you for sharing, Mark.
Yeah, I would really agree with that. Thank you very much for sharing, Mark. I grew up with a decent sense of Lancaster County history and heritage, just because my family is like Mennonite roots and has been in the area for so long. But since coming back to the area and coming out, living in the area, it's been like a journey of getting to know everything anew from a totally different perspective. So I really, really appreciate this more, grounded in reality perspective, grounded in the reality of our community here in this place over the years.
I had vague understanding, but realizing how recent this history is really shocking when I remember that. I'm sure I've heard the dates before, but it always jars me. And then to see that we have this pride flag flying And going through the presentation, it's like, how did we get from where we were to where we are now? And we got there because of people's brave advocacy and their courage and their coalitions. And but yeah, it is a pretty, as Kevin said, a heavy history, and one that people should know about.
I think I'm pretty familiar with it from the stance that I'm involved with Lancaster Pride, and some of our board members make it very important that we are aware of our history, which I agree with. As a younger queer person, things have been relatively okay for me. I fortunately had parents that were very on the more accepting end of things when I came out. But I think it's really important that we all remember our history and our past and where we came from, and seeing that we're kind of really still in our history. Things aren't where they need to be yet, and we still need to work. And while it's easier than it was, we need to really remember those that came before us and put that effort in and continue to put that effort in.
Yeah, one of the names that you mentioned in there, Mark, that I appreciate is Mary Merriman, Reverend Mary Merriman. I teach a seminary course every year, Church and Social Change, and she was in that course. And one of the things I really appreciated about her was that although she's not as sort of directly active in LGBT activism, she's moved to other advocacy for other disenfranchised groups. And one of the things that's really important is that when you begin, whether it's your advocacy comes, I actually didn't start doing a lot of like Black Lives Matter or Black activism until probably like 2012, 2013. I had been doing LGBT activism for much of my youth and much of through my college, because I went to a Christian college, and the policies and those things were not okay. And that took me, but usually it happens the other way. You usually start with something of your own experience or a family member's experience that's been disenfranchised, and then you end up finding other avenues. But just an encouragement that whether you are a member of LGBTQ plus community or not, that those issues matter for the other issues that you care about, right? So if you see discrimination in one area, then you should also be working to educate yourself, which is why I so am appreciative of what you just presented for us, Mark, in other areas. And the phrase, none of us is free until we're all free, is a really important one here. And so thank you for that. Now, I'm going to move us into some other conversation, but I did finally figure out how I could share what I wanted to share. To give us some levity a little bit here, and to kick us off, Mark, you had showed Lancaster Pride, but you didn't show this image here. Can you all see Mark in all of his glory here? So I love that image, and you do it every year. But Mark, I really want to ask, like, how do you manage to get such clean lines on that dye job? I mean, like, this is just impressive. My daughter saw a similar picture. Oh, and thank you for Michelle Johnson, who texted me this picture, courtesy of her. But yeah, how do you do that?
Well, first of all, it takes about 50 years to get the base color. Okay, that's the secret. And then it's actually kind of almost like a crayon or a lipstick, temporary dye. It washes out. It's only ever there for a day. And I am a graphic designer, so I can meticulously color things. And so it takes a little bit, but not too long. And I like part of Pride, I think, and the reason it's important is because a lot of times you have people that it's their first time being in a space that really is so LGBTQ plus welcoming. And I think the whole rainbow, I just try to do some things that get people to engage and get them to smile and kind of enjoy the day.
Great. So yeah, I just mentioned, I'm not a sort of member of LGBTQ plus community. I'm an ally, but I just mentioned, for me, my sort of, I would call it an awakening, but what would be sort of my almost coming out in some sense was having an interaction with Liz's older brother, a friend, that made me start to think about these issues. And Lee was no different yesterday than today when we were at track practice. Lee was no different yesterday than today when we were at theater rehearsal. Like, why were people all of a sudden upset? The person we'd known for 13 years, he wasn't different. right? He was now, revealing something to him, but how is that different than me telling you my favorite ice cream or something else, right? It's part of who you are. And whether it's a significant, deep part of who you are or a less significant part, the reality of you doesn't change the values that I have for you, right? So that for me was what I encountered and what began my own sort of journey over time, continuing to learn about other groups. Okay, that was a young gay man, and then I started learning about other groups and other parts of the LGBT community. So I'm curious for you all. My story doesn't come with trauma or pain. I know I've heard your story before, so I'm going to actually start with you, Brian. Your story is not as easy. Is not just sort of like I woke up one day and now this thing happened and now I'm more welcoming and da da da. Right. So I'd be wondering if you could share as much as is comfortable for you about your story.
Yeah, for sure. So before I dive right into just my coming out story, I just want to provide some context. My parents immigrated to America during the Vietnam War. So they were traditionally Catholic. It was during a wartime. Allentown was very similar to Lancaster, that it was a welcoming city for the Vietnamese community. So, and we lived in poverty. So there's a lot of factors that play into it. So growing up in this traditional Vietnamese household, my voice was always silenced. I never really knew how to express myself with my identity or just like myself in general. So when I was born, everything was laid out for me, from my career path to being a doctor or a lawyer or a doctor lawyer. So I went to school with the intention of being a doctor. I started off with biochem pre-med and really worked my way into a variety of things. And I'm sure we're all aware when you go to college, it opens a variety of doors. So I actually became the first male president of the Gender Resource Center, where it really opens my mind and my heart to who I am and who I wanted to be and who I could be to better off our community. So through that work, I really laid the groundwork to raising awareness on human rights and all the rights in between. So I remember it was finals week and we were nearing the end of the term and my heart was telling me it was time. I didn't want to spend the rest of the summer and living my life in this falsehood every time I brought someone home from college. And I'm sure we're all aware when we bring someone home, it's just like, oh, my friend, my roommate kind of thing. And so I thought it was time. So on May 1st, 2013 at 10:46 a.m., I called my dad, pacing back and forth outside my dorm. I remember my heart was beating. I could hear everything. I could feel everything. It was a sunny day. It was 76 degrees. The air was crisp. And when I called him, I was hoping he wouldn't answer the phone for a variety of reasons. I was hoping that I could leave a voicemail, but he answered the phone. And I just told him outright, do you remember my roommate who I would bring home from college every so often? Well, I loved him and I'm gay. There was silence on the phone, what felt like an eternity. It was a span of about 30 seconds. And what followed was a long line of profanities and ending with being disowned by my family. Sorry, it's starting to bring up emotions again. I remember when I hung up the phone, I just looked at it and then I looked at the sky and I started crying. And I wasn't crying tears of sadness, but I was crying tears of happiness because in my heart, I knew this was going to happen, but a small part of my heart was cautiously optimistic, hoping for the best. But I knew that there was a lot. I cried for a variety of reasons, but for me, it was being able to live authentically and myself and feeling this weight of generational trauma of the Vietnamese culture and just everything in between get off my shoulders. And so I went about my day, and then literally around 2 o'clock, just before my biology final, my stepmom, who I consider my biological mom, or my mom, got on the phone and she called me and she just repetitively just asking why. She was just in denial. And so that was a second bullet that I had to endure. And it was really hard. But since that moment though, and there was a lot of mental health issues. I honestly wouldn't be alive here today if it wasn't for my chosen family and my found family. Because of them, I've developed such a profound appreciation for life and the community that I build everywhere I go. So I vowed on that day to use my skills and lived experience to see the world from a different perspective and provide a space for everyone to feel empowered, to be seen and feel heard. So that's part of the reason why every time I greet someone, I hug them so hard, because I just want you to know that I see you and I'm glad you're here with us today. And part of the reason why I always start my day or greet everyone with happy insert day here is because I'm glad we're all alive to see another day. So yeah, that's my story.
Oh, thank you so much, Brian.
Yeah.
Yeah. You used a phrase, found family, which I think when we covered an event for maybe it was Trans Day, Mickey, I think you used that phrase in the video we put. And I'm curious, you know, what sort of this is obviously now a common theme that I'm hearing. And so I'd be curious what your sort of response or how that works within your own story.
So being disowned by my family, I really had no one to turn to. I really didn't have a very robust support system. And so as I've built my community and have gone through the things that I've been through, there are key individuals in my life who helped me through the very toughest of times. In spirit of full transparency, when I mentioned mental health challenges, I did attempt suicide twice. And through those attempts, there were individuals who helped pull me out of that darkness, that reminded me that you don't necessarily need to be blood to be part of this family that we create. And so I found these individuals who have become this family that I can turn to and look to whenever I'm having a bad day, need guidance or advice, or spiritual guidance, things like that, that has really helped me shape who I am today.
And it seems that it's right. These relationships are deeper than just friendship, right? It's not just a good friend. There's something a little beyond that.
Yeah, we will definitely ride the rainbow to the other side together, do or die.
Thank you. I don't want to sort of like call on people because I'm asking you all to sort of share hard things. But if someone else wanted to respond to that or share their own story or narrative, Brian had already shared that a little bit with us ahead of time. So Mickey, please.
Yeah, so I have a kind of a long, lengthy coming out. I knew I was bisexual at a very, very young age. I always like to say that I liked both Shark Boy and Lava Girl in the Shark Boy Lava Girl movie. So that wasn't an issue for me. But the trans part was really difficult. I didn't know that trans men existed. And that's part of why I'm so visible today. I saw trans women in the news. I saw trans women in my life, but I did not see any trans men. So I thought that that was the only option. It wasn't until I was later in high school that I met my first another trans man. But even then I didn't realize like that could be me. I didn't realize that was something that is me. So it took me a while to come to terms with that and come to grips with that. And once I kind of, you know, the term "you shattered your eggshell," I mean, my egg shattered. And it kind of like within egg shattered, 3 weeks later, I was out and I was pursuing transition. But that denial that I lived in my whole life up to there really impacted just my like every aspect of my day. I also have attempted suicide twice, both before the age of 18, because I was so at odds with how the world saw me and how I felt who I was. And since coming out and transitioning, I've never once had a day where I'm like, you know what, this is it. I don't feel like being here anymore. And before that, it was most days. And I think that's a difficult aspect that a lot of people just, if you're not trans, you don't always get that feeling of what the world sees being so entirely different on every level than who you are on the inside. And probably why Mulan was my favorite Disney princess. But family-wise, fortunately, they were mostly accepting. It still takes some time, but they were, you know, when I came out to my dad, he said, "I'm still your dad, right?" Which I thought was hilarious. I was like, oh, are the genes really running this deep? Is there a trans issue with this? Is it going back generations? But even with that, found family I found has been more important than my mostly supportive biological family, because they don't get all of it. Having that kind of trans family is so important. I find that, when I meet other trans people that are out and visible about their their trans identity and their day-to-day life, you connect with them so much quicker, because you're like, hey, I see you, I know what you're going through, I know why you're being visible for those that can't be. And some of my found family, I don't even talk to them that often, but when I do, it's this like, we've known each other our whole lives, and we can rehash on everything so quickly, and it's just like, oh yeah, we've been hanging out every day for the past 13 years, even though we've only known each other for 3 or 4, and I know these people are going to be part of my lives for the rest of it.
Thanks. And I really want to just express a deep appreciation for sort of how intentionally visible and out you are, because that's such an important part, right? Like, I think most people in America now probably know of or have some level of relationship with someone who's gay, lesbian, bisexual, right? But the level of relationships, I know in my life, I've been able to have the opportunity over time to develop friendships with 2 particular people who are trans that I can think of. And my sort of, not that I was ever sort of in any opposition, but just the level of understanding and awareness just grows instantaneously. And certainly, right, like to your point, that you had a mostly supportive family, but there's still this different element. And so just like literally a thank you to you, because you become one part. We know that narrative is changed so significantly through relationship. So thank you for that, because it is also a burden. It is a burden that you end up having to carry the negative blowbacks of that. And so thank you for being an advocate with your existence.
One more thing there is a ton of people that tell me, you're the first trans person I've ever met. You're the first trans person I've ever interacted with, type, like, so regularly. And I'm willing to answer the stupid questions if they come from a place of genuine interest and understanding for the people that aren't as comfortable with that. This is just a goofy thing. I'm wearing this dingy t-shirt today because it was what I wore to kind of the first year of me going to Prides as me. And I think that's like, I'm never getting rid of this t-shirt, and it is already falling apart 5 years afterwards, because it's such an important thing in my history. And just, I'm only 24, and I've had so many people come to me, and in a place of like, oh, you're someone that I can talk to about these feelings I'm having with my gender, and being able to have, feel that like people are comfortable enough to come with me to these deep questions where I can not guide, but feel like I'm guiding people along their journey, has been really powerful for me, and it made me feel like I've found my path.
Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be happy to go next and just sharing a bit about my story, because I feel like there are two themes there in what Nikki shared that resonate with me. One being denial, and the other being, the importance of visibility. So I grew up very much in denial. I'd say like raised in a household where sort of the way to interact with LGBTQ plus existence is to just go on with regular life, and try to not interact at all with that. So, very sheltered childhood, very, very much, invested in growing up and being like a missionary, staying with the church. And it took me a long, long time of seeing other people out there who are visible. Shout out to Hadassah Wilson, if anyone knows her. She's a good friend of my older sister and the first queer person I was aware of in life. Then also my older brother, Peter, is also gay, and he came out to the family when I was like 12 or so, but still very much in denial of my own identity and in, just a preferred denial of the existence of the queer community. Yeah, that sort of wore off over the course of many years. It's been a long journey for me. I went to an open, welcoming college, and being sort of marinated in that environment of, where queer folks were out, open, accepted, loved, celebrated, finally got me to a place of sort of accepting that reality for other people, and like finding the bigness in my own heart and soul to say, that's wonderful for you. Like, life is indeed a journey, and you should be in control of your own journey. But I wasn't really ready to do that for myself, take control of my own journey. I kind of, what happened was, as long as I could kind of avoid issues of love, family, that kind of future for myself, I just did. Until eventually, many years later, I was living in Jordan, was kind of more accepting of my identity as a gay person, more aware of the fact that if I did ever cross that bridge into thinking of love, family, etc., it would have to be with a man. And I just ended up having too many good straight friends with too many good relationships and marriages to like be okay with sitting that out for myself. And that's what ultimately turned the page for me, and made me realize that, hey, I this is hurting me a lot to hold myself back from what I do believe I deserve as a human being, and it's hurting me a lot to do that alone. So I started sharing with close friends. Much of my community was also Christian, varying levels of conservatism, social conservatism. And that was just super powerful. Some of my friends also came out to me then. So I had a little group of 5 other folks, most of whom were also living in Jordan at the time, and going through very similar processes of deconstructing their faiths and thinking about whether they can fit within Christianity as a queer person. And that sense of camaraderie and solidarity has been super important ever since then, for me, with other queer Christians, other queer folks in general. So I think that I'll jump then to coming back to Lancaster. I reached a point where, okay, I'm feeling supported enough to try living as a gay person, try out a relationship, et cetera, et cetera. But I didn't want to do that abroad, in another culture. Wanted to come out to my family first. And that's also been a really important process. Process is a really key word, I guess, there, because no one in my family was really accepting at the time that my brother came out. And when I first came out, one of my siblings was fully affirming and accepting, aside from Peter himself. And I'm the youngest of 8 kids. So that's a lot of people who are not accepting. And since then, 5 of my 7 siblings have come to a place of full acceptance and affirmation. My parents and some others are definitely not there, but there's huge strength in that. And I've been realizing a lot just the value of tapping into that support network, and not going back to my status quo reality of like just being very, very alone in my queer identity in that part of myself. So I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you. And I just want to honor and I'm sure many of your stories include this as well, but the reality of having your own parents sort of struggling with who you are is something that, straight people don't have, certainly not in the same way. And that is just a massive emotional trauma and burden that you have to, deal with, whether it's your previous status quo of just sort of non-disclosure, you're still dealing with that burden, or once you have that encounter. And so just to honor and recognize that, and for, individuals who are watching this, who may themselves be sort of in the closet or in that space, to understand that, it doesn't have to be alone. And there are clearly people already on this call who have expressed a willingness to be a space for you if you were to need that, or know someone who might. Mark or Liz?
I'll just say the denial, I had forgotten this part of my own story, but probably 3 months before I actually came out, my dad and I were at a track meet, and we were walking from one event to the next, and he said, "You're not gay, are you?" And I punched him in the arm, kind of like lovingly, but in this like, no, absolutely not. Of course not. Why would you think that? And that was my own stuff to work through. I wasn't ready to claim that language. And I think I had my own internalized homophobia about what it meant to be, a lesbian. And I remember thinking, well, I'll never cut my hair. But I didn't want to live into these stereotypes, which it takes a long time to unpack what is so wrong about some of the stereotypes. And of course, they can be very, very harmful. But learning to get rid of all the external judgments or expectations, and to fully embrace my genuine self, regardless of how anybody would receive that took some time. And when I did come out to my dad, and this is a credit to him, he was raised in a context where that was just not okay. And yet when I made it clear that either I show up as a gay person and he accepts that, or I don't show up at all, he turned. And I don't know what enabled him to do that, and why other parents cannot shift as easily as my dad seemed to. But I think for a lot of people, if you are spending 30, 40, 50, 60 years believing one thing, to consider that something else might be true takes a lot of humility and a willingness to be vulnerable and to say I was wrong. And I think that is really, really hard, which isn't to excuse when parents don't do that, or when people in your life refuse to shift like that. But it did give me an insight as to why it is a struggle for some people, and why the bravery of the queer community is all the more brave to me, because there's a willingness to do all that work and to be the vulnerable one. And so I'm just grateful for the stories today, and grateful for my dad who didn't give me up when 50 years of his life would have told him otherwise. And I'm also feeling so sad that that's a rare story.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And I think embedded in what you just said is not only the 50 years of your dad, but also for an individual, as you said, and we've heard the word process, right? Your own, you talked about sort of your own internalized homophobia. Like it's not just those around you, it's you yourself, before you even get to that moment, are having to unlearn and then relearn whole new ways of what is normal, because being gay is normal, right? It's not that normal is straight and then we're just a different thing. It's no, being gay is normal. And to make that transition for your own self, to hear you talking about that, hearing all of you talking about that is deeply powerful to me. Yes, to answer Laura McKinney, I don't know if you see that, Liz, but asking if you pastor a church, and if so, where? This individual's looking for an affirming church.
I'll just jump in. Yes, I do. I'm associate pastor at Grandview Church. It's in Lancaster. It's in the Grandview Heights neighborhood, just outside the city. And when I say affirming, it's not just that the pastors are affirming or the leadership team, but you'll be worshiping with lots of queer people and people with white hair and no hair and with braces all across the board. People are affirming. So you don't have to do what I do when I walk into most churches, which is have my shoulders up here and look for all the fine print that exposes the truth of what a congregation believes, but Grandview is truly an affirming place.
Yeah. And speaking of people with white hair and no hair simultaneously.
Yeah, I thought that too, Kevin. And Grandview is a wonderful place. It really, really is. And I kind of feel it's interesting to me because I feel like I'm even like an earlier generation. Like my dad was a World War II veteran. And I feel like when I grew up, you had a longer time to kind of think about some of these things if you didn't want to deal with them, or deal with them in a private, like even going out to the Tally Ho, I started going there when I was 19, but everything happened late at night, like 11 o'clock or later. So you could go out with your friends and do everything else and then go out with your gay friends to the Tally Ho. And the part about internalized homophobia, like my best friend that throughout college I did go out with, he was the first person I came out to. We went to high school together, and he ended up going to fashion school and stuff. He could sew. He was very kind of gangly and he was a disco dancer. And I remember having a conversation with him before either of us came out, but where there was a woman he danced with, and she was kind of getting frustrated, like nothing was happening in that relationship except dancing. And he's talking to me about this, and like I knew I was gay. I thought, kind of. I hadn't done it then, but I couldn't ask him if he were gay because I just felt like that's what everybody else thinks. How can like his best friend ask him if he's gay? So it took about 9 more months till we finally had a conversation that we came out to each other. And I always felt like very lucky because really when I was growing up, like people weren't out. you were really the exception unless you live in a big city to be out. And so or you were out in very different degrees. Like I really started coming out when I was away in college, and kind of my family was separate from that. And then I moved back to this area and just didn't really talk about that. And then as things started happening and I knew I was going to be more active, because I had been fairly active in groups and things up at Penn State, there just came a point where I told my mom originally, and she was someone that grew up in the Mennonite church, but never joined the church. So like church dogma was never a big thing for her. She was very much like, you think through it and you decide what's correct. And so she was always supportive, but she said, but don't tell your dad. Yeah, because I don't think any of us knew how he was going to deal with it, because he was really kind of a very loving but Archie Bunker type, where you fought in World War II with all kinds of different Americans, and you had a stereotype about each one, and you on a personal level you didn't treat people differently, I think, but you did have boxes to put people in. And finally, I knew we were doing things with Pink Triangle that would be in the newspaper and stuff. And so that's what forced me to kind of come out to everybody. And my dad, we had a conversation, and he used to always grow. He was a big gardener, and he would freeze vegetables. And so throughout the winter, it would be like, oh, do you want some frozen vegetables? So we had this conversation, and it was very just matter of fact and everything. And then he goes, well, do you need any vegetables? And that just was like the perfect, like, this doesn't really matter. And it never really ever was an issue. And I think that the fact of their support, and also the fact that I worked somewhere that had a non-discrimination policy, which was unusual then, because, well, even today in Pennsylvania, there's no protections for queer people to not be fired. And I knew people that were fired only for being gay or lesbian. And so that gave me an ability to kind of be out there a little more than some people at the time.
you're sort of delving a little bit into where we want us to go anyway, which is, okay, we've sort of you've all told your stories a little bit, and okay, so what does that look like from an interaction in the world? And Mark, you sort of our senior historian and lived experience fella here, are old enough to have lived through significant sort of legal changes, right? And Friday, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which is its own separate conversation, but where it certainly comes here is Clarence Thomas's opinion, in which he basically said to community, the legal community, bring them to us, bring us the cases that deal with same-sex marriage, contraception. What the man who is married to a white woman, a black man who's married to a white woman, didn't say, and I, as a biracial individual who's in a biracial or multiracial marriage with multiracial children, what he didn't say is that the Loving versus Virginia case, which makes it illegal to bar marriage for interracial individuals, is also held up by that same sort of legal theory. And so, you're not just talking about the destabilization of Roe v. Wade, you're talking about a massive destabilization. And I'm curious how that hits for you. You talked earlier about sort of seeing things coming around and changing here or there. How does that feel to you? What are you worried about? Or, is the world different enough now that some of those things aren't going to hold? I'm just sort of curious what your thoughts are.
I as a generational person, I guess that's who you're addressing. Everything's changed entirely and nothing's changed at all. It's something that I think every generation, and like the Roe versus Wade shows you have to keep on track to fight for your rights. And the arguments that people have now are pretty much the same arguments they had 50 years ago. And if their argument's not working well anymore, I feel like the trans people are very targeted now, because that the religious right knows that's something that people have discomfort or questions about and don't really feel like they have an opinion. And so they can be swayed and they can be made to fear a group that's really a non-threatening group, and part of that, like whenever you see a trans thing, it's always, oh, a man can go into a woman's bathroom, and they never talk about, well, here's this trans man that's big and muscular and hairy. Do you want him in your bed? You got it. I always kind of felt like they should have, when some of the trans bills happened, they should have done freedom buses like they did in the civil rights and filled it with people that you had no idea what their gender identity was or how they fit in the scale, and just drive throughout the South and go into bathrooms and see if anyone would be arrested for going, and how they would divide everyone up. It's all different and all the same. And with the difference, it is amazingly different. I mean, I've seen things that I wasn't ever sure. The gay marriage thing is something I think a lot of people just did not expect to see. And, I can, in the beginning, like when I'm in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, I think for a lot of gay men, it was like, gay marriage, well, who cares about marriage? Like it was just a total non-issue.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, no, thanks. Your point about sort of visibility, invisibility, right, has to do a little bit with the generational expectations of what was even possible. And when you get to a point like today where, Mickey, you represented Pride at the Trans Day of Visibility, that we have a Trans Day of Visibility, that, I mean, it's not that long ago that they were firebombing a bookstore for having publications on the shelves. And thank God, and may we continue to not have significant violence in these wonderful events that we have. But it is this challenge of like, progress. But that while people no longer feel as able to loudly express their hate, that it's still there, right? Difficulties getting jobs or difficulties, being your full self in a place is different. And for trans, I'm curious, Mickey, being trans, how has that been different? Visibly trans, how's it been different than just being bisexual? I mean, when we talk about oppressions, right? Like I'm Black, like you can see that. So if you are a racist, you don't want to give me a job, you can see that. Whereas visibility for being queer or gay is not always as visible, but for you it is. And I'm curious how this feels, this sort of moment feels for you.
It's a very scary moment, honestly. My partner is also trans. She's a trans woman, and it's more scary for her. I fortunately, as a trans masculine person, if I'm not passing particularly well, I'm assumed to be a butch lesbian. Butch lesbians don't get hate crime nearly as much as effeminate gay men. If my girlfriend's not passing very well, that's a threat to her safety. But in kind of my day-to-day life, I was a server at Annie Bailey's and Conway Social Club for about 2 years. So that's a pretty high volume restaurants in downtown Lancaster. I dealt with some really shitty people that they were fine until they realized this person isn't a straight white man. Um, and then, lose tips trying to walk out on you. Suddenly they don't want to have the conversation they were just having with you 2 minutes before. And even in the place I work now, yes, they fly a trans flag, they're gay owned. I get misgendered there more than any other office I've worked in the past 4 years. And that's just kind of the facts of the situation. I find in queer spaces, even trans acceptance can be divided and people can be on the fence of, oh, maybe we're okay with binary trans people, but I don't get non-binary people or those that use they, them pronouns or those that use neo pronouns. And I feel like it's kind of a selection of who's the smallest group of people we can hate on and get away with it. And right now I do feel like it's swinging towards trans people, and that I see transgender people mentioned probably every other day in the news, and it's never anything good. My extended family says they're accepting of me and then will send articles about why bathroom bans should be happening. And it's like, you're obviously not accepting of me if you don't think I should be allowed to piss in public. And it's scary, and it's kind of why I choose to be so damn visible, because I know it's not safe for a lot of people to be that visible, and I am white, able-bodied passing. It's pretty safe for me to be visibly queer in everything I do, and that, yeah, I've definitely lost job opportunities where on my resume, I keep Lancaster Pride posted at the top because I'm really damn proud of what I've done with this organization, or that I do the phone screen and it's fine, and then they realize, oh, this isn't a woman, and then suddenly they ghost me. So it's an everyday, and it's an active, something you just have to actively choose to not ignore but be aware of. But for my girlfriend, it's a threat on her safety. Like, there are days there she wants to wear something in specific, but she will ask me, do I pass in this? Is it safe for me to go out alone in this? And sometimes the answer, depending on where we're going, is no. And she'll change what she wears or how she acts, or make sure that she has, a cis female friend going clothes shopping with her, because we are in central Pennsylvania. The trans community is not well accepted here. You see what's going on in the school districts. I see what's going on when I go out as me. The queer community as a whole is definitely more accepted than it used to be, but I'm not a city person. My long term, I want to live in the middle of damn nowhere. That's not currently a super safe thing for me and my partner to do.
Right. The KKK that marched in the center of the city has not marched since 92 or whenever that was, but they have continued to have a presence in this county, and they have continued to have rallies, and they don't have them in the city, and they don't have them in the suburbs largely. So, I mean, behind closed doors, people are what they do, but not that sort of very proudly public element that they have done. Joe, so, Mickey talked a little bit about like working at Annie Bailey's and others. I'm curious, so in this sort of, okay, in the world space, you have a background of urban planning, at MIT, or city planning. How can this city or boroughs, like what are things that they are able to do to sort of manifest a more safe environment, affirming environment?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So I'm no expert on this particular part of urban planning. But I do have some ideas about it. One is, planners often find themselves asked to preserve the heritage and culture of an area. And that most often, we can see it here in Lancaster City, manifests as like ordinances to preserve facades of old buildings. But like whose culture are we preserving? And this goes across all kinds of underrepresented and marginalized communities. So, for example, in San Francisco, there's been some movement toward, instead of that kind of traditional historic preservation ordinance, in the Castro area, in some of the other areas that are really important for queer culture and history in the US, any new development there needs to also prove that it's serving the LGBTQ plus community in one way or another, or preserving that cultural identity of the area beyond just the buildings. So I think that's a really important thing for everyone to be considering as we think about how our cities will be developing into the future. And then I guess the other thing that comes to mind is that city planners they can be like very administrative and just sort of facilitate money coming into an area via the creation of new housing, new projects, etc. Or they can be very much, more in the vein of activism, more in the vein of taking stock of, who has benefited in this area over the last few decades and who has lost out. And it's very clear in most areas in the US that the rich, the white, the powerful have benefited, and BIPOC communities, queer communities, etc., we've lost out. So what are ways that we can challenge that kind of inequity and be creating not just, more affordable housing units, but how to get those affordable housing units into the hands and lives of folks who have been structurally held back. And housing is a really important issue for so many other things as a starting point for flourishing in community. So those are some quick thoughts on it.
Oh, yeah, thanks. To your point about sort of cities and resources, I'm drawing back to Mark's presentation at the beginning. And when the KKK picture is marching, you have police riot gear right beside them. But I didn't see any pictures in front of the Closet bookstore where there was police presence while the place is being bombed, right? So who gets protected is very, interesting when you start to look deeper about how resources are deployed. Mark, were you going to say something there?
Well, and with the bookstore, the first time it was bombed, it was kind of, I think, by the police passed off as a prank, like I don't think they even really investigated that much. And then, Nancy did, she was willing to be out there and expose herself, and at that time, even within the, you'd have these closeted gay men that are like, well, Nancy, she's such a butch lesbian, I don't really want her representing us. And I'm like, well, then you get out there and, but they, they weren't willing to do that at that time. So she was very exposed, and it took a lot of effort and a toll on her to kind of pursue it. And when it was bombed the second time, they really were forced to, they actually did find who did it.
Mm-hmm. Liz, so we've heard a lot of sort of religion-y stuff here, and you're the one who sits in that space. I am curious. Often individuals across the board are leaving the church, and largely because the church has had elements of it hijacked and associated with hate, as if it was sort of the point of religion and faith. And so people are sort of leaving or whatever, but you're also creating this safe space. But that safe space that you're explicitly creating is for individuals who have been harmed, really harmed and targeted. And I'm just curious how that part of your process, and we've had in the chat people who are looking for affirming spaces, how have you all sort of, what's happened in your community? I mean, you're the first openly queer pastor ordained by the movement of inclusive Methodists, and you are very much at the center of this conversation. And I'm curious what is there for people.
So back to that word process, Grandview did not get to where Grandview is overnight. And a lot of it happened through storytelling within the congregation. We invited outside speakers in first to tell their story. And I'm talking back in the 90s, maybe late 80s. Mark, if you know the dates, you can show them, put them in the chat. But we began inviting queer people in to tell their own stories of the harm that they've experienced. Because I do think for many people, there's just not that awareness of the actual lived reality of everything a queer person goes through, of the sleepless nights and the racking your brain and the years of self-denial. So inviting brave souls to come and tell their story to a group that was willing to listen was a big part of the process. And then as the congregation witnessed that bravery, then they began to share their own stories. Oh, well, my granddaughter is also gay. Oh, well, I have a cousin who's, and it became, did you hear about that family? And they have a gay granddaughter and they still love her. Okay, well, maybe I can, and it just spread sort of organically that way. Part of the work as well is that the lead pastor before my time and before my colleague Andrea Brown's time, he would tell every new visitor, new member that while the United Methodist Church still has this prohibition against gay and lesbian clergy, he does not support that policy. So he was very vocal and visible in his allyship, and that let people know that Grandview was not going to participate in that discriminatory practice. So over time, that also sort of helped to create the ethic of inclusion that the church now very proudly expresses all the time. What I'll say though about the whole safe space thing is that it really is less about safety and more about the bravery that the people bring into that space. I mean, there's only so much we can do to create truly safe spaces. And we do our best to make sure that the boundary of the church is respect for human dignity. And we can be a place of diverse points of view, but we will not entertain conversations that invalidate a person's human worth, their sacred value. So that's been part of our practice, but it's still, anytime a queer person goes into a religious space, it is an act of bravery, because it's not just about that local community, but all the history and the much larger, louder voice of the capital C church is that you can't be queer and you can't be Christian. Those two things can't coexist in the same person. So when queer Christians show up in church spaces or religious community, it is a tremendous act of bravery. And so what we try and do is support that and honor that and say, we'll do everything we can to make sure that you don't have to be any braver than you already are being right now. And we also lift up those voices and bring queer people into every tier of leadership. We have them, I mean, I get to preach and I'm very lucky for that, but we bring in other queer voices as well. And I think that what will continue to make Lancaster and the wider area a more inclusive place is if people will keep telling their stories. And not just queer people sharing their traumas, but if you heard something today that you found meaningful or brought you into greater awareness, then find a way to respectfully communicate that story to somebody you know who might need to hear it. I think that there are ways that we can be in conversation, and that those seemingly insignificant conversations can actually plant seeds that eventually grow into something that's really beautiful and wholly inclusive.
Thank you, Liz. It is 11:30. I always come to the end of these feeling like, NPR radio station where they're quickly trying to jam in everybody, producers and all those names. I do want to thank everybody. Liz, I really appreciate your sort of closing there. And I hope I haven't overstepped too much. I was trying to also present, as the only non-queer person on this call, some of my own story, because whether you are queer or not queer, you have a part in this community, and to be able to learn and grow your own self from the awful things that we've been learned and socialized. And so, we thank each and every one of you for for your participation today. It is 11:30, so I understand people may need to drop off, but I am going to ask each one of our panelists to just say a quick word to anyone who may be watching this, whether it's youth or otherwise, who may be struggling. Just a reminder, sort of the "it gets better" type of thing, but it is not hopeless. And I've seen hope provided, encouraged, and modeling in so many places. And so that's my reminder to those to reach out if you need help. But I'll just let others pop in and then we'll finish.
Well, I was going to agree that Grandview is a great space, but different congregations resonate with different people. And I'm involved with a group called Embrace. That's a Lancaster group. And I did put in the chat, if anyone's interested, I have like a list of about 30 different faith groups, not even all Christian. There's a Jewish synagogue that are welcoming and affirming, and I'd be happy to share it with anyone.
I just wanted to add, for me, Pride is more than just a month. It's a state of body and mind. So just because June is over, that doesn't mean we should stop being able to live authentically and courageously and unapologetically as ourselves every day without fear or judgment. So you do you, boo. Just live your life as true as you can be. And I will just leave this quote out there because it's my favorite quote and how I interact with everyone, which is labels are for clothing, labels are for filing, labels aren't for people. Even if you don't know how you identify, just go with the flow. There's tons of resources, as you heard through this conversation from Mark, Liz, and all of us, from Lancaster Pride through the Lancaster LGBTQ Coalition. We're here for you. You're not alone. We're here, we're queer, and we're not going anywhere. So you have family here.
I'll jump in. I think that the last thing I want to share is just like the thought that was really important to me when actually taking the steps of coming out and living into my identity, which is just that the reality is the reality, right? None of us get to choose who we are, but it is a gift to be accepted. And it's a gift for everyone to accept, really. And I appreciate what you said earlier, Kevin, about coming to realize that being gay is normal. Me being gay is normal. Other people being gay, queer, trans is normal. And I just think that's really important to repeat to oneself over and over again, and to repeat to each other, because I can still sometimes leave family functions, etc., just feeling very, very abnormal, very much an outsider, very excluded. But that's on them. It's not on us. It's not on our community, and reality is not really up for debate. I also want to put a quick plug out there. I'm not super out to my clients at Church World Service. It's a very cross-cultural space, and many folks are coming from backgrounds that are super conservative. But I just want to say that small things, small acts of visibility to the broader community, I hope will also reach folks who might be in, contexts under different layers of needing to hide. And so I'm open to talking if that reaches anyone in that community.
I would just like to say thank you. We have a lot of work ahead of us still for acceptance for all marginalized communities and equal treatment for all. And our visibility is super important, and that if anyone in here is a little confused with their gender identity and just needs someone to talk to, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is mickey@lancasterpride.com, MICKI. And I would love to chat or guide you in a direction for some resources that really helped me on my journey, because I kind of stumbled upon it on my own, and having having someone to help guide and, is really important and helpful. And even for those that aren't trans, just have a queer elder with you. It helps your journey a lot.
Just add that there's a whole group of people rooting for you if you're a queer youth or however you identify, you're being cheered for. And your queerness is not a flaw or anything that people have to get over to love you in spite of this part of you. And in fact, I consider it a superpower because it makes you more empathetic. It gives you a greater eye to notice the person who's being kicked out or pushed away. So if it's hard to embrace, I understand that too. But I hope that someday you embrace the fullness of who you are and know that all along that process for you, you've got this group of people and beyond who are cheering you on.
Thank you all. Go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to add to that yes, your identity really is a gift that you were given. And it's a gift that you should share with other people authentically.
Thank you
and
all.
Volunteer for some of these groups. I'm sorry.
Yes.
There are, if you're feeling isolated, you see churches, there's CAP, there's Lancaster Pride, all of them are really good groups with really great people. And you can get to know some people.
Volunteer, donate, get involved, and rub shoulders. Thank you all for your participation. Panelists, Mark for the presentation. All of you who participated. The recording of this will be sent out. And so if you know someone who could use this conversation to hopefully help them in some way or another, you will be invited. You'll be sent it, and we invite you to share that. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.